she lied the moment she walked in. It wasn't a malicious lie, just the kind of necessary fiction people tell when they are trying to survive their own lives. She said she only needed a quiet place to work, somewhere away from the noise of construction she claimed was tearing her office apart. But you don't wear a tailored charcoal suit that costs more than my entire inventory just to sit in a dusty corner of a failing bookstore because of a few jackhammers. The visual contrast was immediate, bordering on violent. My shop is a landscape of soft edges, worn velvet armchairs, leaning stacks of paperbacks, dust motes dancing in lethargic beams of afternoon light. She was all sharp lines and expensive leather, a silhouette cut from steel and dropped into a watercolor painting. The air changed the second the door chimed behind her. It wasn't just a customer entering, it was a shift in atmospheric pressure. The silence, which usually felt comfortable and drowsy, suddenly felt attentive. I felt a sudden, prickly awareness of being watched, even though she barely looked at me. It started as an accident, a random choice of a coffee shop alternative, but it became a ritual neither of us could name. My bookstore, the paper anchor, has always been a sanctuary of dust, old paper, and silence. It's the kind of place where time moves like molasses, where people come to get lost, not to be found. The floorboards creak with a familiar rhythmic groan, and the air smells permanently of vanilla and decaying glue. I've spent years curating this specific stillness. It's a refuge for the wanderers, the dreamers, the people who need to escape the relentless pace of the city outside. Then came the intrusion of precision. Violet didn't wander in. She arrived. The bell above the door, usually a gentle greeting, sounded sharp, almost alarmed. I was behind the counter, repairing the spine of a first edition, when the rhythm of the shop broke. Click, click, click. Her heels struck the hardwood floor with a military cadence that was entirely too loud for the space. There was no hesitation in her stride, no meandering through the new arrivals, or pausing to admire the display of local poetry. She moved with a terrifying efficiency, a woman who measured her life in billable increments. She stopped at the counter, not too close, maintaining a precise distance that felt like a boundary line drawn in the air. Up close, the details of her armor were even more intimidating. Her blouse was silk, pristine, and terrifyingly white. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful, exposing the sharp, elegant line of her jaw. She didn't smile. She looked at me, or rather, she looked through me, assessing the utility of the space. "I need a table," she said. Her voice was low, crisp, devoid of the usual pleasantries my customers offered. "Somewhere secluded. My office is currently uninhabitable. Construction." "We have tables in the back," I said, my voice sounding too soft, too casual in the face of her intensity. "It's usually quiet back there." "Good, quiet is what I require." She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and for a split second, the facade slipped. I saw her hand grip her phone, a sleek, dark device that probably held the fate of a corporation, and her knuckles were white. It was a small detail, a fracture in the porcelain. I realized then that she wasn't just annoyed by construction noise. She looked exhausted. Not in the way that sleep fixes, but in the way that suggests a soul-deep weariness. She looked like a woman who was holding up the sky and was terrified that if she exhaled, the whole thing would come crashing down. "The corner table is free," I offered, nodding toward the shadowed nook by the philosophy section. "It has the best light." She nodded, a single, sharp motion, and marched toward the back. I watched her go, feeling the air settle in her wake, charged and restless. She didn't order coffee. She didn't browse. She claimed the table like she was planting a flag. Within minutes, she had constructed a fortress. A laptop, a tablet, 2 phones, a notebook bound in black leather. She sat with her back to the wall, facing the room, creating a perimeter of technology that hummed with silent urgency. I went back to my book repair, but my focus was shot. The presence of her precision in my chaotic, dusty world was distracting. I could hear the aggressive clatter of her typing, a machine gun rhythm that cut through the soft jazz playing on the speakers. I thought she would last an hour. I thought the dust would offend her, or the lack of ergonomic seating would drive her back to her glass tower. But the hours ticked by. The light shifted from gold to blue, and she didn't move. She stayed until I had to dim the lights, a statue of modern industry in a temple of forgotten words. She returned the next day, and the day after that. It became a routine so precise you could set a watch by it. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the lull between the lunch rush and the after-school crowd, the bell would chime. Violet would enter, the same sharp silhouette against the afternoon sun, carrying the same aura of contained chaos. She would nod to me, a microscopic inclination of her head that I had to learn to catch, and retreat to her corner. But the atmosphere of the shop began to shift. The silence felt constructed now. It had architecture. It was heavy, charged with a static electricity that seemed to radiate from her corner table. Her presence changed the gravity of the room. Even when she was dead silent, staring at a spreadsheet with eyes like flint, she was the loudest thing in the space. I found myself moving quieter, placing books on shelves with deliberate care, afraid to shatter the tension she brought with her. I began to learn the sensory details of her invasion. The shop usually smelled of vanilla, dry rot, and the sweet almond scent of aging paper. Violet brought a different weather system entirely. When I walked past her table to organize the philosophy section, I caught the scent of her. It was crisp, ozone, expensive coffee, and something cool and sharp, like winter air clinging to a wool coat. It was the smell of high-altitude boardrooms and sanitized glass, cutting through the warm, dusty haze of my world. It shouldn't have belonged there, but after a week, the shop felt incomplete without that sharp, cold note hanging in the air. By the second week, the aggressive clatter of her typing, which had initially sounded like gunfire, started to slow. There were long stretches of silence where her hands rested on the table, still intense. I would be at the counter, pretending to tally receipts, and I would watch her reflection in the darkened window. She wasn't looking at her screens. She was looking out at the street, or at the ceiling, or, increasingly, at me. It happened first when I was on the rolling ladder, shelving a stack of heavy art books on the highest tier. I felt the gaze before I saw it, a physical weight between my shoulder blades, a sudden heat that had nothing to do with the exertion. I paused, my hand hovering over a spine, and looked down. Violet wasn't typing. She was watching me. Her expression wasn't impatient or judgmental. It was unreadable, dark, and intense. She didn't look away when I caught her. She held the look for a heartbeat, 2, 3, unflinching. It was a look of assessment, but not of my inventory. It felt like she was trying to solve a complex equation, and I was the variable she couldn't quite factor. Then she blinked. The moment snapped, and she returned to her phone with a seamless shift back to professionalism, but the air remained thick. I realized then that she wasn't here for the non-existent quiet. She wasn't here for the spotty Wi-Fi or the lumpy armchair. She was here to be unseen by her world, but seen by me. In her office, she was likely the sun everyone orbited, the person who had to have every answer, every strategy, every solution. Here, she was just a woman in a corner who didn't order anything. She needed a place where no one asked her for a decision. But she also needed to know she was still there, still solid. She used my gaze as a tether to keep from floating away into the abstraction of her own success. We existed in this strange, silent dance for days. I was the keeper of the sanctuary, and she was the refugee who refused to admit she was running. The tension grew. A wire pulled tighter with every afternoon she spent in that chair. We were two people sharing a small space, breathing the same charged air, pretending that we were strangers. The first crack in the wall didn't come from a grand confession. It came from a simple recommendation. The fortress fell on a Tuesday. It started with the laptop lid snapping shut. A final, decisive click that echoed in the quiet shop like a gunshot. I looked up from the register, expecting Violet to pack up and leave, to march back out into the cacophony of the city she ruled. But she didn't leave. She stood up, smoothing the front of her charcoal trousers with a sharp, nervous gesture I hadn't seen before, and walked toward me. She stopped at the counter, but this time there was no barrier of indifference. She looked at me, her eyes alert. "I can't look at another spreadsheet," she said, her voice rougher than usual. "I need to read something real, something that bleeds." It was a strange request from a woman who seemed made of polished chrome, but I knew exactly what she needed. "I have a rare edition of essays in the back," I said. "It just came in. It's heavy." "Show me," she commanded, but the edge was gone from her voice. I came out from behind the safety of the counter. Leading her into the stacks felt illicit, like I was guiding a wolf into a sheep pen. The literature section is in the furthest corner of the shop, down a narrow aisle formed by 2 towering oak bookcases that lean slightly inward, creating a tunnel of books. It's the most intimate space I have. As we walked, the air grew heavier, scented with the vanilla decay of old paper and the dust of 1,000 unread stories. I stopped at the end of the row. "Top shelf," I murmured, pointing upward. The book was wedged between 2 larger anthologies, hiding in the shadows. Violet stepped in beside me. The aisle was too narrow for 2 people to stand abreast without negotiating space, but she didn't hang back. She moved into my personal radius, close enough that the air between us grew thin. I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, a feverish heat that defied her cool exterior. The sound of her breathing was audible in the quiet, steady, but slightly shallow, as if she were waiting for a collision. My heart did a traitorous double beat against my ribs. I had to reach for the book. I stretched up, my shirt riding up slightly at the waist, exposing a strip of skin to the cool air of the shop. I felt her gaze on me, not on the books, but on the movement of my body. It wasn't predatory. It was attentive. It felt like a physical touch, tracing the line of my spine. My fingers hooked the spine of the book. I pulled it free, dust motes dancing in the disturbed air, and turned around. I hadn't realized how close she was. I turned and nearly collided with her. She hadn't stepped back. She was standing inches away, occupying the space with a terrifying confidence. The world narrowed down to the gap between us. I could see the fine grain of her skin, the slight flare of her nostrils as she breathed in. The silence in the aisle wasn't empty anymore. It was screaming. "Here," I whispered. The word came out breathless. I held the book out. She reached for it. She didn't take the edge. She reached for the center, and for a second, her hand closed over mine. Her skin was shockingly warm. A jolt of static electricity, sharp and biting, snapped between us. It should have been a warning, a physical manifestation of the danger of touching something this high voltage. But neither of us pulled away. Her fingers lingered on the back of my hand, pressing down, grounding herself. She looked up, and for the first time, the CEO mask was completely gone. Her eyes were dark, dilated. There was no apology in them, no polite social retreat. She was looking at me with a raw, terrifying hunger that had nothing to do with literature. It was an open challenge, a silent admission that the distance she kept was purely physical. "Hiding in Plain Sight," she read the title, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating in the small space between our chests. "Is that what we're doing?" "I think that's what you're doing," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. She didn't deny it. She slowly, deliberately, slid her hand from mine, taking the book with a friction that felt like a caress. The loss of her touch left a cold spot on my skin. She stepped back, the spell stretching but not breaking, and clutched the book to her chest like a shield. "Thank you," she said. She turned and walked back to her table, but she didn't open her laptop. She sat down and opened the book, her fingers tracing the page where mine had just been. The corner table wasn't enough anymore. The distance had been breached. The weather turned violent just before closing. It wasn't a gradual shift, but a sudden, temperamental collapse of the sky. One moment, the street was bathed in the weak, diluted gray of an autumn afternoon. The next, the world outside the plate glass window was erased by a wall of water. The rain didn't just fall. It hammered against the pavement, turning the city into a blurred aquatic abstract. Inside, the shop shrank. The corners grew darker, the shadows stretched long and intimate, and the sound of the downpour created a heavy, rhythmic isolation that made the rest of the world feel light years away. We were the only two people left on Earth, sealed inside a capsule of old wood and yellow light. Violet was already packing up. She had been checking her watch every 3 minutes for the last half hour, a nervous tick that betrayed her calm exterior. Tonight wasn't just a late work night, it was an event. She had changed in the small, cramped bathroom at the back of the shop earlier, emerging in a dress that made my breath catch in my throat. It was black silk, severe and elegant, cut to cling to her frame like a second skin. It was a dress designed for climate-controlled limousines and heated ballrooms, not for a sudden deluge in a drafty bookstore. She stood by the front door, staring out at the sheet of rain with a look of genuine defeat. She had her phone in one hand, likely trying to summon a car that was hopelessly delayed by the weather, and her trench coat draped over her arm. But the coat was thin, a decorative layer meant for style rather than survival. As I watched from the counter, I saw her shoulders hunch slightly. A shiver ran through her, visible even from across the room. It was a crack in the armor. Violet, the titan of industry, the woman who commanded boardrooms with a single raised eyebrow, was cold. She looked small against the backdrop of the storm, a porcelain figure threatening to shatter in the drop in temperature. I didn't think. I just moved. I walked around the counter, grabbing the scarf that hung on the hook by the register. It was mine, a thick, chunky knit of gray wool that had seen better days. It was cheap, slightly frayed at the ends, and smelled faintly of the vanilla candles I burned in the shop and the lavender detergent I used at home. It was the antithesis of everything she wore. It was rough, domestic, and utterly unpretentious. I approached her from behind. The sound of her heels usually announced her presence, but in the roar of the rain, my sneakers on the wood were silent. I stopped just inside her personal radius. "You can't go out there like that," I said. My voice was low, barely rising above the drumming of the rain on the glass. Violet turned, startled. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown dark in the dim light. She looked at the scarf in my hands, then up at my face. She didn't argue. She didn't make a polite refusal about being fine. She just stood there, shivering, her lips parted slightly. "It's freezing," I added, stepping closer. The distance between us evaporated. I was close enough to see the goosebumps rising on the smooth skin of her arms. I raised the scarf. "May I?" She gave a microscopic nod, more of a surrender than an agreement. I reached out, my hands moving slow and deliberate. I didn't just hand it to her. I wrapped it around her. The act felt incredibly heavy, laden with a domestic intimacy that had no business existing between a shopkeeper and a CEO. I looped the wool around her neck, pulling it snug. The rough texture of the knit contrasted violently with the smooth perfection of her skin and the silk of her dress. My knuckles grazed the sensitive skin of her throat as I tucked the ends in. Her breath hitched, a sharp, audible intake of air that she couldn't suppress. I froze, my hands lingering on the wool, resting just above her collarbones. I could feel the heat radiating off her, a feverish warmth that seemed to leap across the gap to my cold fingers. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I was dressing her, protecting her, claiming her in a way that felt far more possessive than a kiss. I was wrapping her in my scent, sending her out into her high-stakes world, wearing a piece of my quiet, dusty life. She looked up at me, her gaze unflinching but incredibly soft. The hard, precise lines of her face seemed to blur. "Thank you," she whispered. It didn't sound like gratitude for a Lent item. It sounded like a confession. It sounded like she was thanking me for seeing her, for realizing that beneath the silk and the steel, she was just a person who could freeze. "Keep it," I said, my voice rough. "Bring it back when you're done with the world." She reached up, her fingers brushing mine as she touched the scarf, holding it against her neck. She nodded, unable to speak, and turned to the door. She pushed out into the storm, a flash of black silk and gray wool, leaving me standing in the sudden, aching emptiness of the shop, the heat of her skin still burning on my fingertips. We were dancing around the truth, terrified to name it, but the real world was waiting to intervene. The sanctuary held for 3 more days before reality kicked the door in. It wasn't the weather this time. It was a person. The bell chimed on a Thursday afternoon, sharp and aggressive, announcing an arrival that didn't belong in the dust and quiet. He was young, dressed in a navy suit that was tailored too tight, radiating the frantic energy of a man whose career depended on someone else's mood. He didn't browse. He scanned the room like a tactical team clearing a building, his eyes dismissing the literature and the history as mere obstacles. He spotted her in the corner instantly. Ms. Sterling. The name sounded obscene in the hush of the shop. It was a title, a brand, not a name. I was behind the counter, but I felt the change in the air before I saw it. I turned to watch Violet. It was like watching a film reel snap and splice in a different scene. The woman who had been absent-mindedly tracing the grain of the wooden table with her thumb vanished. In the space of a single breath, she dismantled herself and rebuilt the CEO. Her spine straightened, locking into a posture of rigid, terrifying authority. Her face, which had softened over the last few weeks, hardened into a mask of marble and indifference. The transformation was instantaneous, a survival reflex honed over years of boardroom warfare. She didn't look up. She simply stopped being the Violet I knew. "James," she said. Her voice dropped 10 degrees. "I am working." "We've been pinging your phone since noon," James said, marching past the fiction section without a glance. He invaded her radius, placing a thick folder on the table with a slap that echoed like a gunshot. "The acquisition team is spiraling. You can't just go dark, Violet. The board is asking questions." "I am not dark. I am occupied." "You're in a bookstore," he scoffed, looking around at my peeling wallpaper and leaning shelves with undisguised disdain. "This isn't work." I felt a flash of heat in my chest. It wasn't defensiveness about my shop. It was protective rage. I saw the tension in Violet's jaw, the way her knuckles whitened as she gripped her pen. She looked trapped. She looked like she was drowning, and this man was trying to hand her an anchor instead of a rope. She was trying to carve out a single hour of silence, and they wouldn't let her have it. I couldn't watch them drag her back. I picked up a clipboard holding nothing but old shipping manifests and walked out. From behind the counter, I moved with a purpose I didn't feel, stepping directly into the line of fire. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting through his monologue. James turned, blinking at me as if the scenery had started speaking. "We're busy." "So are we," I replied, keeping my voice level, matching his corporate cadence. I turned to Violet, ignoring him completely. "Ms. Sterling, I have those valuation figures for the 17th century manuscripts, but if we're going to finalize the appraisal before the market closes, I need your full attention. We can't have interruptions during the authentication process. The lie hung in the air, absolute and absurd. Violet Sterling didn't appraise rare books. She bought companies." James frowned, his momentum stalling. "Appraisal?" I didn't blink. "Ms. Sterling is consulting on a highly sensitive acquisition. Her expertise is expensive, and frankly, this interruption is costing me billable hours." I held my ground. I wasn't the shopkeeper anymore. I was the gatekeeper. Violet looked up at me. For a split second, the mask slipped, revealing a flash of shock. Then, she caught the thread. She looked at James, and her eyes were deadly. "You heard her?" she said, her voice ice cold. "I am in the middle of a transaction, James. Leave the briefing. I will review it when I'm done here. Go." "But the board—" "Go!" It was a command, not a request. It was the voice of a woman who could dismantle his career with a phone call. James looked at the folder, then at me, then at the terrifying woman he worked for. He realized he was outgunned. He muttered an apology, backed away, and fled toward the door. The bell chimed his retreat. The silence rushed back in, but it was vibrating now. Violet didn't move until he was gone. Then the tension poured out of her frame. She slumped slightly, the marble mask cracking. She looked up at me, and the gratitude in her eyes was so raw, so unguarded. It felt like a physical touch. 17th century manuscripts? She asked, her voice soft again. It sounded expensive, I said, putting the clipboard down. You lied for me, she whispered. I protected my consultant, I corrected. We have a strict policy against interruptions. She looked at me, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, a real one, not the shark smile she gave the world. In that moment, the dynamic shifted irrevocably. We weren't just customer and owner anymore. We were conspirators, partners in a quiet crime against the noise of the world. The sign in the window flipped from open to closed with a plastic clack that usually signaled the end of my day. I threw the deadbolt, the heavy thud resonating through the floorboards like a period at the end of a sentence. Normally, this was the moment I exhaled, the moment the performance of commerce ended and the shop became mine again. But tonight, the ritual felt different. It didn't feel like I was locking the world out. It felt like I was sealing something in. I didn't ask her to leave. Violet was still at her table in the corner, though the laptop was closed now. The aggressive blue light of the screen had been replaced by the shadows stretching long and deep across the room. I walked to the switchboard and killed the overhead fluorescents. The shop plunged into darkness, save for the single amber pool of light from the banker's lamp on my desk and the faint orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the rain-streaked window. The space transformed instantly. The stacks of books became looming canyon walls, and the scent of vanilla and old glue seemed to thicken in the gloom, becoming richer, heavier. I went back to the counter, expecting her to gather her things, to check her phone, to break the spell. Instead, she stood up and walked toward me, carrying nothing. She moved slowly, navigating the shadows with a strange, dreamlike hesitation. She stopped at the counter, leaning against the worn wood, her face half illuminated by the desk lamp. The harsh, fluorescent-ready lines of her suit were softened by the warm light, casting her in gold and obsidian. She looked less like a titan of industry and more like a noir heroine waiting for the train that would take her away from it all. "You're open late," she said softly, though we both knew the shop had been closed for 10 minutes. "Special hours," I replied, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. "For preferred customers." The air between us had changed again. The frantic energy of the afternoon, the conspiracy against her assistant, had burned away, leaving something quieter and far more dangerous. We were alone. The city outside was a distant, muted hum, a world that felt light years away from this circle of light. "My office isn't under construction," she said suddenly. She didn't look at me. She traced a groove in the countertop with a manicured fingernail, watching the movement as if it were the most interesting thing in the room. "I know," I said. "I figured that out around week 2. She let out a short, dry laugh, devoid of humor. "It's too quiet there," she admitted, finally meeting my eyes. "Or maybe not quiet enough? It's a glass box in the sky, soundproofed to perfection. But when it's that quiet, I can hear everything. The servers humming, the emails pinging, the sheer, crushing weight of everything I'm supposed to be. I can hear the noise of my own success, and it sounds like screaming." She looked vulnerable then, stripped of the CEO armor, just a woman tired of her own reflection. I needed a place where the noise was different, where the silence had texture. "Dust and paper," I offered. "Dust and paper," she agreed. "And you." The admission hung in the air, heavy and sweet. She hadn't come for the Wi-Fi. She hadn't come for the coffee. She had come for the specific frequency of peace that I provided. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the counter, closing the distance between us. The professional excuse was dead, buried under the weight of her confession. "I stay here because I like the ghosts," I told her, offering a piece of my own truth to match hers. "Every book on these shelves is a voice. When it's quiet like this, I don't feel alone. I feel accompanied." Violet looked at me, her gaze traveling from my eyes to my mouth, then back up. The tension that had been simmering for weeks began to boil. It wasn't the frantic sparks of the handbrush in the aisle. It was a slow, rising heat. The counter was the only thing keeping us apart, a physical barrier that felt increasingly flimsy. "I don't feel alone right now," she whispered. "Neither do I." We stood there in the pool of amber light, the silence of the shop wrapping around us like a blanket. We were safe in the dark, two conspirators who had stopped running. We were poised on the edge of something irreversible, safe in the quiet, completely unaware that the weather outside was turning violent, preparing to trap us in the dark for real. The perimeter breached in a single, violent second. It started with a flicker, the overhead lights stuttering like a dying heartbeat, before a crack of thunder shook the floorboards beneath our feet. Then, absolute darkness. The power didn't just fade, it was severed. The hum of the refrigerator in the back, the electric buzz of the street lamp outside, the faint, mechanical breath of the city, it all vanished in a single, violent second. We were plunged into a darkness so heavy it felt tangible, a physical weight pressing against my eyes. The silence inside the shop was instantly replaced by the roar of the storm outside, which sounded less like rain and more like the ocean trying to reclaim the land. "Stay there," I said, my voice cutting through the black. "I know the layout." I moved by memory, navigating the maze of book stacks with the instinct of someone who had walked these aisles 1,000 times. I found the emergency kit under the counter, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of a flashlight and the rough cardboard of a matchbox. I struck a match. The sound was sharp, a burst of friction that smelled of sulfur, and a tiny, trembling flame bloomed in the dark. I lit the vanilla pillar candle on the counter, then 2 more on the display table. The shop transformed again. The shadows didn't retreat. They danced. The flickering orange light caught the spines of the books, turning the gold leaf titles into glimmering eyes watching us. It softened the edges of the room, erasing the dust and the wear, turning the space into something ancient and primal. Violet hadn't moved. She stood where I had left her, a silhouette against the blacked-out window. I brought a candle over, shielding the flame with my hand. The light washed up her face, casting long shadows from her lashes, hollowing out her cheekbones. She looked stripped down, the sharp angles of her corporate armor melted by the soft, wavering light. "The street is gone," she whispered, gesturing to the window. I looked past her reflection. The streetlights were dead, but in the flashes of lightning, I saw the water. The gutters had failed. The road was a churning river of black water rising over the curb, lapping dangerously close to the sandbags I kept for moments like this. The wind was howling, rattling the plate glass in its frame. Leaving was impossible. The city had shut down, and the elements had locked us in. "We can't stay out here," I said, watching her shiver as the temperature in the drafty main room began to plummet without the heating vents. "The insulation is terrible. The back office holds the heat better." She nodded, following me without hesitation. We retreated into the back room, a space I rarely let anyone see. If the shop was a sanctuary, the office was the inner sanctum, a cramped, chaotic nest of invoices, half-finished coffee cups, and a worn leather sofa that had seen better decades. It was tiny, forcing us into a proximity that felt inevitable. I set the candles on the desk, pushing aside stacks of catalogs to make room. The light here was brighter, more concentrated, bouncing off the cream-colored walls and creating a warm, golden cocoon against the storm raging outside. Violet sat on the edge of the sofa, her knees almost touching the desk chair where I sat. The space was so small that our personal atmospheres overlapped. I could smell the rain on her clothes, mixing with the vanilla of the candles and the scent of old paper. The storm felt distant now, a muffled violence that only emphasized the stillness between us. She looked around the room, taking in the clutter, the personal photos tacked to the corkboard. The life I lived when I wasn't being a shopkeeper. Her eyes landed on a stack of books on my desk, the ones I was reading, not selling. "You live 1,000 lives in this room," she murmured. "It keeps me from getting bored with my own," I replied. She turned back to me, the candlelight catching the dark intensity of her eyes. She looked at me for a long time, the silence stretching, heavy and expectant. Then she spoke, her voice low and steady, reciting words I knew by heart because I had handed them to her weeks ago. "We spend our lives building fortresses to keep the world out, only to realize too late that we have walled ourselves in with the very things we were trying to escape." She paused, the words hanging in the air like smoke. "Page 42, she added softly, hiding in plain sight. My heart hammered against my ribs. She hadn't just read the book, she had memorized it. She had taken the philosophy I gave her and internalized it. "You're not hiding anymore, Violet," I whispered. "No," she admitted, leaning forward slightly, the movement bringing her face into the halo of the candle. "I suppose I'm not." The real turbulence was in the room, in the terrifying electric silence that falls right before the lightning strikes. There was nowhere left to go. The exits were flooded, the lights were out, and the excuses had all burned away. We were just two women in a small room, and there was nowhere left to hide. The silence that followed her recitation wasn't the empty, comfortable silence of the bookstore. It was a heavy, structural silence, the kind that exists right before a demolition charge detonates. The candle on the desk flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls, but Violet sat perfectly still. The quote hung between us, a bridge she had built but was terrified to cross. I knew I couldn't let her retreat. If we let this moment pass, if we let the storm fade without acknowledging the lightning strike, she would put her armor back on in the morning, and I would never see her again. "That's a dangerous quote to memorize," I said, my voice low. "It implies, you know you're trapped." Violet looked down at her hands that signed million-dollar contracts, hands that steered the fate of thousands of employees, now resting uselessly in her lap. "I know a lot of things I don't say out loud." "Why did you really come here, Violet?" I asked. The question was a risk. It pushed against the fragile truce of our arrangement. It wasn't the construction, and it wasn't the Wi-Fi. You have a penthouse that overlooks the entire city. You have quiet that money can buy. Why here? Why this dusty, failing shop? She looked up, and the raw honesty in her eyes knocked the wind out of me. It wasn't the look of a CEO. It was the look of someone who had been holding their breath for a decade. "Because here, I'm not a publicly traded commodity," she whispered. Her voice cracked, a sound like glass stepping on stone. "In my office, in my apartment, even in my own car, I am a function. I am a decision-making machine. But you," she paused, her gaze searching my face, measuring the reaction. "You looked at me that first day, and you didn't see the suit. You didn't see the net worth. You looked at me like I was just a person who needed a chair. You looked at me like I was real." The confession stripped away the last layer of her defense. She wasn't the titan of industry in that moment. She was just a woman terrified of her own isolation, admitting that she had been starving for a human connection that didn't come with an invoice. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, telegraphing every inch of my intent. I walked the 2 steps to the sofa and knelt in front of her. The change in elevation shifted the power dynamic instantly. I wasn't serving her. I was worshiping the truth she had just offered. I reached out, my hand hovering for a fraction of a second before cupping her jaw. Her skin was fever hot, a stark contrast to the cool dampness of the room. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering shut, a sigh escaping her lips that sounded like a building collapsing. "I see you, Violet," I murmured. "I see all of it." Her eyes opened, dark and wet. "I know." The gap closed. I didn't rush it. I wanted to memorize the hesitation, the anticipation, the architecture of the moment. When my lips brushed hers, the control she prized so dearly evaporated. It wasn't gentle. It was a collision of breath and need, a frantic reclaiming of lost time. She tasted of rain and expensive lipstick and fear. Then she broke. The kiss deepened, becoming desperate, a frantic attempt to bridge the distance between our worlds. Her hands tangled in my hair, gripping tight, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in her storm. It wasn't just desire. It was relief. It was the physical manifestation of months of holding her breath. When we pulled apart, she didn't retreat. She buried her face in the crook of my neck, and I felt the hot, wet slide of tears against my skin. Violet Sterling, the Iron Woman, was weeping. Not loud, sobbing tears, but a silent, shaking release of tension. I held her, wrapping my arms around the silk of her dress, becoming the frame that held her together while she fell apart. We stayed like that for hours, tangled together on a worn leather sofa while the storm raged itself out against the walls. Eventually, the adrenaline faded into a heavy, exhausted peace. She fell asleep against me, her breathing evening out, the fierce lines of her face finally smooth. I watched the candle burn down to a stub, the wax pooling on the desk, wondering how we would survive the sunrise. Because the morning light is cruel. It demands answers. It brings the inevitable return of reality. The morning light didn't ask for permission. It invaded. It cut through the blinds of the back office in sharp, unforgiving slats of white, slicing across the worn leather sofa and the tangle of our limbs. I woke up first, squinting against the brightness, the taste of sleep and stale anxiety in my mouth. The storm had passed. The silence outside wasn't the heavy, pregnant silence of the lock-in. It was the busy, indifferent hum of a city that had already moved on. Car horns blared in the distance. The rumble of a subway train shook the ground beneath the floorboards, and the splash of tires on wet pavement signaled that the floodwaters were receding. The magic of the night before, the candlelight, the confession, the suspension of time, felt incredibly fragile in the face of the sun. Violet was still asleep, her head resting heavily on my shoulder, her breathing slow and deep. In the daylight, she looked younger. For a moment, I allowed myself to pretend that this was just how it was now, that we could stay in this back room, barricaded by books and dust, safe from the demands of shareholders and quarterly projections. But then, her phone buzzed on the desk, a harsh, vibrating demand that shattered the fantasy. She stirred, shifting against me, and then her eyes opened. There was a moment of disorientation, a soft confusion that was heartbreakingly human, before the memory of where she was crashed in. I felt her muscles tense against me. The armor began to reassemble itself before she even sat up. She pulled away, sitting on the edge of the sofa, running a hand through her hair. The intimacy of the night evaporated, replaced by a sudden, awkward awareness of the morning. What time is it?" she asked. Her voice was husky, sleep rough, but the cadence of the CEO was already creeping back in. 7, I said, checking the clock on the wall. "The world is awake." She nodded, standing up. The movement was stiff, mechanical. She walked to the window and peered through the blinds, assessing the damage to the street, assessing the route back to her tower. I watched her, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. This was the part where she left. This was the part where the logic of the daylight overruled the emotion of the dark. She would put her shoes on, smooth her dress, and walk out that door. And by the time she reached her office, I would be just a memory, a quaint anecdote about a stormy night in a bookstore. She began to dress. It was a painful transformation to watch. She pulled on her heels, the click against the floor sounding like a gavel banging down on a sentence. She smoothed the silk of her dress with shaking hands, snapping the fabric into place, erasing the wrinkles of our night on the sofa. She found her trench coat, draping it over her arm like a shield. She didn't look at me while she did it. She was focused, efficient, terrifyingly precise. I stayed on the sofa, wrapped in the blanket, feeling smaller with every piece of armor she reclaimed. I wanted to say something, to ask her to stay, to ask her what this meant. But the words felt too heavy, too desperate for the morning light. "I have a board meeting at 9, she said finally, turning to face me. Her face was composed, the mask back in place. "Of course," I said. My voice sounded hollow. She walked to the door of the office, her hand hovering over the knob. She paused. The silence stretched, agonizing and thin. Then she turned back. She looked at the desk, then at me. Her eyes weren't the cold flint of the CEO anymore. They were the eyes from the candlelight. "I left something," she said. I looked at the desk. Her laptop, the sleek, gray slab of metal that contained her entire empire, was sitting there, closed. Next to it was her tablet. She hadn't packed them. "You're forgetting your work," I said, confused. Violet shook her head. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "No, I'm not forgetting it. I'm leaving it." I stared at her. "You can't run a corporation without that." I know, she said softly. That's why I have to come back. The implication hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't an accident. It was collateral. It was a promise. She was leaving the keys to her kingdom in my dusty back office to ensure she couldn't disappear into her glass tower. She was tethering herself to this place, to me. See you tomorrow, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She opened the door and walked out into the bright, loud morning. The bell chimed, a cheerful, everyday sound. I sat there for a long time, looking at the laptop on my desk. The most powerful woman in the city had walked out unarmed, leaving her armor with the shopkeeper. The shop is quiet again, but it doesn't feel hollow. The dust motes dance in the sun, and the air carries the faint, lingering trace of expensive perfume. I pick up the book from the desk, hiding in plain sight, and place it next to her laptop. The walls are down. If you've ever found sanctuary in a person rather than a place, subscribe for more stories like this.